SEP Fanfic Readings presents 1,000 Words by Olive Juice 28. Chapter 35. Part of the Team. The snow was just beginning to melt on the castle grounds, and the tiniest whiff of spring could be detected in the air every once in a while, if one was paying close attention to that sort of thing. And someone most certainly was. In fact, over a dozen very enthusiastic, ready-to-start-flying again someones were chomping at the bit to get back out on the Quidditch pitch with their fearless leader. The first year still met during the winter months, using the empty room on the ground floor where Ferenzi had held his lessons a few years back. The headmistress had allowed the magic that had transformed the room into an outdoor space to stand, although it wasn't nearly as large as the pitch. It at least gave the feel of being outside and provided enough room for the small group practices and maneuvering demonstrations. When they weren't taking turns learning to roll or zigzag, the group would sit in a circle in the middle of the enchanted clearing and watch as Draco charmed a team of Quidditch figures, his own from when he was a child, to play out different strategies and fly in formation. Their volunteer instructor had been pleasantly surprised at the level of enthusiasm they had all shown over discussing the history and the rules of the game. While he had always been fascinated by the sport, he knew not everyone shared that interest, especially not his favorite witch. Whenever the topic came up in conversation around the dinner table, a glazed look would come over her face with almost comical immediacy, and he knew she was off somewhere else in her mind. He wasn't bothered, though. He didn't share her passion for freeing house elves or color-coded study schedules, so he figured they were even. The first time she had found him preparing for one of these indoor sessions, however, she commented about his lesson plans, and that one took him by surprise. Granted, he was sitting at one of the round tables in the common area, surrounded by books and parchment, and every so often would flick his wand and send a few of the figures into some sort of play, which he would then furiously scribble notes about in preparation for what he would be sharing the next time they all met. As he took in the young faces before him, Draco was once again struck with how vastly different this school year was from all of his others, and how glad he was for it. He had grown surprisingly fond of his gaggle of 11- and 12-year-olds, and knew they were going to go berserk at the announcement he was about to make. "All right, settle down," he hollered good-naturedly and gestured for them to take a seat on the grassy floor of their classroom. "Got some news for you today before we discuss the World Cup of '97. First, this will be the last time we meet in here." Wide eyes and gasps of dismay met his statement, and he couldn't hide his grin as he continued. "We'll be back on the pitch next week." As he had expected, they exploded. Several of the boys had rocketed up from their sitting position and were jumping around, pumping their fist in the air. Yes, quite exciting," he chortled as he settled back down. "But that's not the only news. I've been given permission from Headmistress McGonagall to let you all form 2 teams and play an actual game." He covered his ears as he finished speaking, knowing what was about to happen, and he was right. For a split second there was complete silence as mouths dropped open and eyes bugged, and then they lost their minds. Every single one of his first years was on their feet, whooping and cheering and hugging their friends. Christopher had tackled him around the waist with a vice-like grip, and Olivia was wringing her arms repeatedly, shrieking, "Really?" He allowed the insanity to continue for a half-minute longer before shooting off gold sparks with his wand to get their attention once more. As they all flopped back down on the ground, he grinned at their exuberant faces and started to explain the plans he'd made. The idea had come to him a few weeks prior, but he seriously doubted that McGonagall would allow it. Amazingly, she not only supported the scheme, but offered Madame Hooch to referee, and said that if things went well, perhaps they could even play a match for the rest of the school to attend. Draco was dead chuffed, and he couldn't wait to tell the younger students. He knew they weren't really anywhere near as fluid or coordinated as older players, and they hadn't even begun to practice defensive maneuvers, which were crucial to a match. But it was more about giving them a chance to try than anything else. He knew they would take this opportunity seriously and practice hard for it, and that was all he asked of them. They spent the rest of their time together discussing the logistics of teams, positions, and practices, never once broaching the topic of the World Cup he'd prepared for that day. He chuckled and shook his head as he gathered up the bag full of supplies, listening to their excited chatter as they left the room. He'd just have to save that for a rainy day, he supposed. Professor Slughorn wove his portly self in and out of the rows of desks in his potions classroom, leaning over cauldrons, perusing notes, and observing the 10 students currently occupied with the brewing of one of the most intricate recipes they'd ever been given, Intentis. The potion consisted of 14 different ingredients, most measured in minuscule amounts. and the bulk of its substance containing a combination of boiled devil snare vines and diluted manticore blood, neither of which were quick to process. If the potion was brewed correctly, Intentis worked like a combination of Veritaserum and Felix Felicis. It did not force one to speak the truth, or give them luck in all of their endeavors. Instead, whoever drank the prescribed dosage would be able to tell the true intentions of anyone they interacted with over a specific period of time. The potion would basically give them the ability to know someone's innermost desires, although not reading their mind, and would also grant them a limited amount of power in steering the other person in a certain direction. In essence, it gave the imbiber heightened intuition and powers of persuasion. This particular potion was not as well known as many of the others Slughorn had assigned his most advanced class, but he felt it was an important one for them to learn. Unlike its more potent counterparts, Intentis was not illegal or banned in any way, mostly because it did not possess the strength to so drastically alter one's behavior like the other two potions did. The only side effect of taking too much was a lingering fixation on whoever the witch or wizard was trying to read, and a slightly foggy feeling until it left their system completely. The professor was pleased to see everyone's cauldrons contained similar shades of mint green liquid, which meant that they were all successful so far. Granted, they still had quite a bit to go, but he had good faith in each of them that they would accomplish the task. While the verbose wizard had previously focused his attention on the students he considered to be most promising, or most influential in their future endeavors, the disastrous school year prior had distinctly shaken his preconceived notions and ideologies to their core. He had spent less time teaching potions and more time comforting terrified first-years, or healing battered rebels, or meeting secretly with fellow faculty who opposed Voldemort's newly appointed minions, than he could account for. All he knew at the time was that titles and positions and long-revered names meant nothing. Blood status or the size of Gringotts vaults meant nothing. Whether someone was famous, or they had been never heard of beyond their home village, meant nothing. What did matter, he understood more clearly than he'd ever considered necessary or possible, was what one believed in and how they acted on it. The bravery and compassion he had witnessed in so many of his students last year had impressed him, and their acts of selflessness brought more than a little shame on him. He had stood on the sidelines, thinking only of himself for far too long, afraid of drawing negative attention, and petrified of the possible consequences should that have happened. When the dust settled, he had wallowed in self-degradation as he convalesced and determined it was time to make some changes. He had accepted Minerva's offer to stay with more enthusiasm than she'd obviously expected. If her raised eyebrows were any indication, and decided from that moment on to invest his time on all of his students equally, and to focus on himself far less. The result of this change of heart did not disappoint. His younger students were much more relaxed around him, and his older charges, though skeptical at first, quickly warmed to his inclusive attempts and often sought him out beyond the classroom. The group of 8th years currently under his watchful eye, however, were his favorites, and he had intentionally spent a portion of each class period during the first few months of school and gauged each of them individually as they worked. Some of them were more known to him than others already, of course, like Miss Granger or Mr. Longbottom, although much of that information was what everyone knew due to the nature of their involvement in the downfall of the Dark Lord. He chose to set those bits of biography aside as he approached them, however, wanting to get to know them as young adults that they were, not as the wizarding world perceived them. Over the months, Slughorn had learned that Neville had a dab hand at herbology, and that he was passionate about finding uses for magical plants that could improve the care of those suffering long-term effects of curses. He realized that Hermione's ability to recite portions of textbooks verbatim was not, as he had unfortunately assumed, based on a desire to best her fellow classmates, but instead was simply part of her deep love of knowledge and her insatiable need to understand the way things worked. Likewise, his conversation with Dean taught him the young man was an avid sports enthusiast, both in the Muggle and magical world, and that he desired to pursue a career in sports commentary or journalism in the future. Most surprisingly, however, were his encounters with Draco, who not only proved to be an excellent potioneer, but had also completely shed the arrogant and sneering persona he had worn like a suit of armor in previous years. Slughorn grudgingly admitted to himself that he had written the boy off as a pompous, entitled bully, whose famous connection to Voldemort had caused the professor to tolerate him as a student, but dismiss him entirely as a person. From their brief, but deeper-than-surface-level conversations, Slughorn could clearly see that he was not the only one to return to the castle that year with a drastically altered heart. He also started to notice partway through the fall term that the tall blonde seemed to be developing a bit of an attachment to the lovely Muggleborn he often shared a table with. And this observation was solidified after the holiday break when classes resumed. Whereas they previously might have worked with one another, or with other classmates, now they only shared a table together. They also appeared to be more familiar with one another, exchanging knowing glances, and working together in tandem as if they knew the next move the other would make. He even spotted the young man reaching for his partner's hand under the table a time or two, which made him smile. He was a bit of a romantic himself, truth be told. As the lesson came to a close, each cauldron was placed on a shelf under a stasis charm until their next class. The professor sent them out the door with a genial wave, and watched as the unlikely couple he'd grown rather fond of headed out together. Once in the corridor, Draco took Hermione's hand as they walked towards the stairs. "I'm heading to the library to meet Allison for our weekly catch-up before I go back to the room for dinner. What's your afternoon look like?" "I'm due to meet Christopher in the common room for a game of chess." Draco gave a dry chuckle. "I can honestly say I never envisioned myself ever willingly entering the Hufflepuff dormitory." He snorted. If my second-year self could see me now, he'd be completely horrified. They both chuckled at that, knowing he wasn't wrong. "I suppose I never thought I enjoyed spending time with Slytherins either, much less considering one of them my friend," she admitted, thinking about her young charge. "Is it awful of me to be thankful for the things that happened?" Draco stopped walking and turned to face Hermione fully. "What do you mean?" "I'm not thankful that people died, Merlin, no." He shook his head vehemently, hoping she understood what he was trying to say. "But if the war hadn't been waged, then nothing would have changed, would it? We would have graduated last year and simply gone on with our lives, never knowing, never having." His voice faltered as he took in the witch before him. He could not imagine his life without her, and he knew they would never have crossed paths this way if the atrocities of the last year had not occurred. He also felt a pang in his gut thinking about never meeting his first years, or taking on their flying lessons, or even being back at Hogwarts for this year at all. He still felt horribly guilty for his part in the war, but he couldn't help feeling more grateful that he could have put into words. As he met the chocolate-brown eyes that were studying him with such a deep-level understanding and compassion, he knew he didn't have to explain himself further. Hermione pushed up on her tiptoes and kissed him, her hand squeezing his more tightly. When she lowered herself again, her eyes were shifting and a soft smile graced her features. "Christopher will be waiting." She tilted her head towards the stairs. He nodded. "Allison, too." They made their way to the entrance hall, where Draco gave her a quick hug before heading off for the other set of stairs that would take him down to the Hufflepuff dorms, and Hermione began to descend the ones that would take her to the library. Partway down the empty hallway, she spotted a figure heading her way. She didn't think anything of it until she recognized who it was and inwardly groaned. "Well, if it isn't the Gryffindor princess!" Adrian Pusey greeted her from several yards away. He strutted up to her as if he owned the place, and stopped directly in front of her, his eyes roving over her as they had done during their previous encounter. The act made her skin itch, regardless of the appreciation infused into his leer. "Hello, Adrian," she responded politely, thankful for her armload of books. Otherwise, she would have already pulled out her wand, which there really was no need for, and she didn't want him to know how much he got under her skin. "Where are you off to? All by your lonesome." He smirked and quirked a brow in what she was sure he felt was a flirtatious way. "I'm meeting one of my first years in the library." "One of your first years?" He looked confused for a moment, but recovered quickly. "Ah, yes, the mentoring program, right?" He sneered as he said it, making it clear that he didn't find much worth in the idea. "Not sure what McGonagall is trying to accomplish with that, but if it makes her happy." He shrugged as if he was personally placating her by going along with it. "It's actually a brilliant idea and has been extremely successful." She bit out and then clamped her mouth shut, not wanting to continue the conversation. He didn't seem to care that her tone was less than inviting. Yes, he waved a hand dismissively. "House unity and all that. Fantastic. I'm glad you're enjoying it at least." Suddenly the gleam in his eye was back and she didn't like it. "You know, Hermione, I'd love to hear more about how well this endeavor is going. Perhaps you'd have dinner with me this evening. I should be done with my meeting with the board in time." Once again, his eyes traveled down her length and back up again, a smirk on his lips. "Oh, thank you for the invitation, but I already have plans." She willed her voice to remain steady as she continued the multiple ways she could hex the pompous wanker. He chuckled. "Plans? Those plans wouldn't happen to include a former housemate of mine, would they?" Her eyes narrowed before she could stop herself, and he could tell he'd hit a nerve. "Malfoy's still trying to gain your affections. You know, just because he's in your year doesn't mean you have to give him the time of day. You could have your pick of wizarding society, being the golden girl and all." He took a step closer, as if getting ready to tell her his secret, leaning down slightly so his face was only inches from her own. "I'm sure a witch such as yourself would appreciate the experience someone outside the school walls could offer." He twirled one of her curls near her shoulder with his finger and lowered his voice so it almost came out as a snarl. "I'd be more than happy to show you." But before he could continue whatever abhorrent thought his mind had conjured, they were mercifully interrupted. "Miss Granger, I was just looking for you." Professor Slughorn was huffing and puffing his way down the corridor. Hermione had never been so happy to see the potions master in her life. "Thank Godric, I'm saved." She immediately took a giant step back from Adrian, forcing him to let go of her hair and standing up straight as he scowled at the stout wizard who had halted beside him. "What do you need, Professor?" Hermione turned to face him and prayed to all the founders that he would see the desperation in her eyes and remove her from the situation at once. "Your essay on the Intentis potion," he began, nodding firmly as if in answering her unspoken plea. "I wanted to discuss the final paragraph. Have you considered the merits of Borges' theory on using a shrivel fig? There's a chapter on that very subject in a comprehensive guide that Madame Pince has only recently acquired." He gestured in the direction of the library. "We could take a look at it now if you have time." Hermione tried not to exhale a sigh of relief too loudly, but nodded enthusiastically. "I was just heading to the library anyway, so that would be great." "How fortuitous." Slughorn chuckled in his dramatic way, as if the stars had aligned just for him. "I hope you don't mind, Mr.—" He eyed Adrian suspiciously, unsure who he was and why he was there in the first place, but definitely not liking the way the younger wizard seemed to be imposing himself on Hermione. "Pusey," Adrian gritted out, clearly annoyed. "Adrian Pusey. I'm on the school's board of governors." He puffed up a little, as if this impressive bit of information could put the older man in his place. "Ah, of course. There's a meeting today, isn't there?" Adrian scowled at the fact that Slughorn knew his purpose in the castle. "Don't want to keep the others waiting, do you?" And with that, the potion master gently placed his hand on Hermione's arm and steered her around the intruder. She bit the inside of her cheek at the look of annoyance on the former Slytherin's face and simply called a cheerful "Bye" over her shoulder as she ambled down the hall with her professor. Once they reached the library doors, she turned to make sure Adrian was well and gone before turning a beaming smile on her good Samaritan. "Professor!" She met his concerned gaze with mischief dancing in her eyes. "You know we haven't written an essay on that potion. We haven't even finished brewing it." He winked conspiratorially and tilted his head. Nor would Borage ever suggest using a shrivel fig for such a task. They both chuckled, and Hermione shifted her books in her arms to free one of her hands so she could place it on his arm. "Thank you, Professor. Your timing could not have been more perfect." She gave it a small squeeze as a genuine smile spread across her face. "Yes, well, you're very welcome, my dear." He seemed slightly embarrassed by her earnest gratitude, but was very pleased to have been some help. "Wouldn't want anything to come between you and Mr. Malfoy, now would we?" Her eyes widened at his observation as he continued. "You two work so very well together. Your potions are always top-notch." He studied her thoughtfully for a moment before going on. "It's important to acknowledge when we found a good partner. It'd be a shame to miss out on what you two might be able to accomplish in the future." He gave her a knowing look and a fond smile as he patted her hand. "Off you go." And with that, he turned away and set off back down the corridor, leaving Hermione to wonder if he was only talking about their potions lessons anymore.